Now that's what I call an overdue haircut.
Right now we're going to sit here until 1:30, and that's when air traffic control is going to give us an update as to what our time to Newark is going to be.
All in all, what did we lose? Like an hour?
In front of the women's bathroom.
Yeah. Well, they don't know that till you said it.
There's a sign right behind your face.
All right, let's go.
Maybe they did know that.
Let's go. Merry Christmas.
And I had
Cold?
it dripped cold water on me.
Oh, this is nice. Now, it's kind of like I have multiple homes, but something never really changes about what makes home. The people. It's the people you care the most about, ones you can't do without. So I guess you could say I'm home. Alright, so over the time that I was traveling, when I was visiting my parents back home, didn't play any poker at all. I had loose plans to try, but those kind of fell through. Had other things come up, and the weather was super cold. So rather than trying to put in like a 2-hour session in New Hampshire, I just didn't play. Took the time off, and I think that was probably the right decision. But I still wanted to kind of put out some content from that time, since it was a lot of fun. Got to fly my drone around a little bit, and I've actually had kind of a store of hands saved up for a while now, and figured I would dive into some of those. So all of these hands are pretty much ones where I think I either took a line that was either definitely not the best, or there were other options available that might have played better. There are other hands that I didn't misplay that I could have included here, but I figured it would be nice to kind of group them all together like this. So with that being said, I do believe all of these hands are played at 2-5, but they are played from a variety of sessions, I think 3 or 4 different sessions, so they're not exactly necessarily going to follow any kind of game flow or chronological order. They're just standalone hands. Let's get into it. In this hand, there's 2 limpers, the small blind completes, and I'm in the big blind with 10-5. No reason to raise here, so I check my option, and we are going 4 ways to a flop. The flop comes queen, queen, 10, rainbow, and small blind checks to me. I don't really like betting here, mostly because the things that we get action from beat us, and there's not a whole lot we should be trying to protect from on this board. However, I did come out and bet 15, and the cutoff ended up calling. The turn is the 9 of hearts, which completes the rainbow. I check, and the cutoff checks it behind. The river's now a queen. Still a full rainbow board, but there's 3 queens on the board, so I now have a full house, which means I'm chopping with any 10. Pretty unlikely that he has any better full houses than a 10 Like pocket jack seems incredibly unlikely given this is a limped pot. So I'm beating pretty much everything now, except for quads, and I think quads is also pretty unlikely. Trip queens would have likely bet the turn or raised the flop. I mean, it's possible he's slow playing a queen, but I think it's okay to bet here. I go ahead and bet 30, he calls, and my hand is good. So seems pretty likely he just was calling down with like ace jack offsuit or something like that, where he, you know, he had a gut shot on the flop and ace high on the river and just felt like he was going to catch a bluff. But we take that one down. In this hand, I'm under the gun with pocket tens, and I raise to 25. Under the gun +1 and the hijack both call, so we're going 3 ways to a flop. It's an above average board for us. Flop top set on 10-6-5 rainbow. Now, this table has been pretty loose, pretty passive, and willing to call down with a wide variety of holdings, so I think it is definitely defensible to bet here. I go ahead and put one out. I bet 50, and under the gun +1 surprises me. He puts in a raise. So under the gun +1 raises to 140, and he's got about 1,500 behind, and I cover him. So this is a pretty great spot. Folds to me, and I think kind of the default play here is to call. I think a call is usually going to be correct, just because there's very few hands that I would want to 3-bet here, either for value or as a bluff. It just makes sense to call a little bit more often from that perspective. The thing that made me push towards re-raising was that he had never really taken an aggressive action like this post-flop, where he wasn't just c-betting as the pre-flop raiser. He had only kind of called down with draws. I had no reason to think he has any bluffs here. So I pretty much put him squarely on sets and potentially something like 6-5 suited, which there are only 2 combos of because it's a rainbow board. So I did decide to put in the next raise, to put in the 3-bet. I ended up making it 330, not a particularly large 3-bet, mostly because I wanted to be able to put stacks in by the river. He ended up tanking a pretty long time and ultimately folded. I was pretty disappointed. I think the main reason to call here is that on the off chance he has just an overpair like jacks or something like 6-5 that he's actually willing to raise fold, we don't really give him that opportunity. And occasionally, you know, we let 6-5 improve and definitely never fold. So I think calling is probably a hair better, but I did think it was pretty unlucky he didn't have like a set in this spot to just get it in for a bunch of money. In this hand, I'm in the low jack, and I look down at 9-6 of spades. The pot's not opened yet, and I decided to make a little bit of a loose open to 25. Unfortunately, I get a whole bunch of callers. The hijack, the cutoff, the small blind, and the big blind all call, so we are going 5 ways to the flop. We flop pretty well given the circumstances. It's ace 8-5 with 2 spades. The ace is a spade on the board, so an ace high flush draw is not possible. When it checks me, I decide to c-bet 75, which I think is fine. It's a little bit tricky into so many people. I definitely wouldn't mind checking, potentially check raising, but betting seems fine too. The hijack is sort of already reaching for a call as I'm putting my bet out, and he does quickly toss it in. We go heads up to a turn card, which is King of Hearts, and I decide to check it over to him, which I don't really love. Even if I could maybe go for a check raise, I think it's much better to check raise the flop than the turn. I think we just have a lot more fold equity there. And at this point, I think I give him the opportunity to check back a little too often with hands that he might fold. And this is a hand that I could definitely turn into a triple barrel spot. So I don't really love checking, but I did check, and he actually checks it back. So kind of all the things I just mentioned. The river comes, the 10 of hearts. We totally break out. I don't think there's a lot of value in betting here, because if he had a draw himself, I think he would have likely bet the turn. So he probably has something with decent showdown value. I'm not sure a bet's going to get him off the hand. So I do decide to check it, and he checks it back and wins with ace 10. There's 2 limps. I complete in the small blind with jack 9 suited, and the big blind checks. I think you could make a case for bumping it up here, but I actually don't mind completing, at least some of the time. The flop comes jack 6-3, and I put out a bet. I bet 10, and it folds to the cutoff, who makes the call, so we're going heads up to a turn. I think the flop bet is totally fine, but it's the turn where I have an issue. The turn's a 2 of diamond, which is a brick, but At the same time, I think it's going to be a little hard to get value from any worse hands here, aside from maybe draws, but I can check call against those and check evaluate river cards. Don't think there's a real need to bet to protect against draws here. And technically the deuce does bring in 4-5, but I think 4-5 is pretty unlikely. However, I did decide to go for a bet here. I bet 30 and the cutoff quickly calls. At this point, I'm definitely starting to have some alarm bells. He felt pretty comfortable in this spot, and I thought it was much more likely he had a jack than just some kind of draw, particularly when I sized up on the turn, although it's not a huge bet to begin with. The river is a sort of confusing card. It's the jack of spades. So we do make trips and our absolute hand value increases, it improves. But at the same time, I still expect him to have a jack reasonably often. The interesting thing about this card now is that if he does have a misdraw, I can't really get any value by betting it. And if he has a better jack, I'm losing. So I decided to check, which I think is probably the correct play. Planning to check evaluate, but most likely check call just on the off chance he has a big draw and decides to bet. But if he has misdraws, it's less likely I have misdraws. So it's hard to say whether he would really pull the trigger here or not. That being said, I don't have a whole lot of better hands that I would check this river after betting twice. So pretty much stuck with check calling, I think. He does go ahead and bet 50, which the sizing kind of screams value, but I still kind of stuck with the plan. I couldn't get away from it, so I called it off, and he had queen jack. So kind of a frustrating spot for me. I went kind of back and forth about the river decision. Not sure if I can really ever fold a hand this good in this spot, because most of my better jack X I would just be betting myself. I'm certainly betting queen jack or better, and I'm not sure whether I bet jack 10 or not. I think it all really comes down to whether he can bluff or not, and that's just a hard thing to know kind of in the moment, and especially after the fact without really more notes about like the game flow and the dynamics. In this hand, I open king jack of clubs in middle position to 20. The hijack and the button both call, so we go 3 ways to a flop. The flop comes jack 3 deuce with 1 club, and I throw out a C bet. I bet 40, the cutoff folds, but the button continues, so we're going heads up to a turn card. The turn's an 8 of clubs, which sort of threw me off at the time. I got a little bit in my head about what I thought he'd be willing to call 2 streets with, and the fact that I had 2 clubs in my hand. I just got a little bit turned around. After the fact, I feel pretty confident that we should be betting here. There's definitely worse jack X that can call. There's not a whole lot of better hands that he can have. There's sets, but there's not a lot of those combos. He can have ace jack, but again, not a lot of combos. So there's also queen jack, jack 10, potentially stuff like jack 9 suited that can call. And he might still have something like 4-5 or ace 5 or ace 4. So I definitely think betting is better. If we ever were to get raised, we can just evaluate based on having the flush draw, if we can potentially call. But I did decide to check. He did oblige us with a bet. He bet 50, which is pretty small, kind of surprising sizing. I ended up calling, just expecting kind of my hand to be pretty good, but not something I want to try to raise for value and kind of accidentally turn into a bluff. The river comes a deuce of clubs, bringing in my backdoor flush, and I think I make another mistake here by checking it over to him. I think a bet is going to be much more valuable. I think he just has way too many give-ups and checkbacks here. Even something like ace-jack might not bet the river. At these stakes, people are a little bit more passive, a little bit less willing to value bet. Not that this is even that thin of a spot, but they're less willing to value bet thinly in general. So I do check. He checks it behind, and I turn over my flush, and it's obviously good. So some of those hands, obviously worse offenses than others. I kind of just wanted to throw these all together to show there's plenty of hands where I think either in the moment or after the fact that I didn't play it that well, or maybe I just kind of missed some value, something of that nature. It doesn't necessarily mean I won or lost a hand, and it doesn't mean, that my session was horrible. It just means that, there's varying degrees of mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. Some of them bother me, some of them don't. If you haven't watched my darker side of the game video, that video contains a hand where I felt like I made a very large mistake for me. I just didn't follow through on a read that I had, and it ended up costing me a lot. I don't really feel that way about any of these hands. These are kind of smaller mistakes for the most part, but I think it's important to review your mistakes in these kinds of hands because even though they're small individually, they do add up. And, you know, these hands are spread out over multiple sessions, but, you know, you make a few of these mistakes per session, and if you ignore them, they just stick around. Whereas if you kind of pay attention, try to play them better the next time around, it's going to really add to your bottom line overall. I don't think I said this in any videos so far. Happy holidays to everybody, and I hope everybody has a good new year. I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about my loose goals and kind of hate the word resolutions in respect to the new year, because it makes it feel like it's just something to be talked about when the new year comes around and not necessarily followed through on, or at least that's the connotation in my mind. So I'm not. It's okay. So that's sort of the connotation in my head. I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to kind of collect my thoughts about it and then chat with you guys about it. Maybe I will do that in like a live stream format or something a little down the road. The only other thing I wanted to say is that coming up pretty soon, I'll be in Atlantic City for about 10 days. So on the 16th of January, I will be driving over and I'll be there until the 26th. So I'll pretty much be focusing on the Winter Poker Open. Yes, I am staying in something nicer than a motel on Whitehorse Pike. Don't worry. I'm splitting a room with a couple guys, and we're going to be, I think, at Borgata to start, and then we'll switch over to Harrah's. So that should be pretty nice in comparison to my past couple stays. If you guys haven't subscribed yet, please do. You can also hit the bell icon to make sure you get notifications. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up. Consider sharing this video, and I will see you guys next time.
I'm sorry, I'm in your view. Sorry. I'm sorry.